Scott Arniel, head coach of the Winnipeg Jets. I mean, I don't think this is shocking or surprising by any stretch of the imagination. He was thought of as the front runner, as soon as we heard the news of Rick Bowness. But now it's been announced. We've had a couple days to think about it. We've heard from Scott Arniel as well as the organization. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would add a word in there. Almost kind of felt inevitable to some degree that, unless, with just given this search versus the last search for a head coach and all the names that you were hearing and the time that it was taking, I mean, even, hearing guys were doing interviews over Zoom. I mean, that I don't know about you, but that kind of suggested to me that not that they weren't taking these interviews seriously, but kind of felt like more like a fact-finding mission than necessarily a pursuit to bring somebody else in. And, about the decision, I mean, look, from a personal level, like I like Scott Arniel. I think he's always been a great guy, a great person. He's always treated the media with respect. I know he has the respect from, the players. He's really good at one-on-one instruction. He's a guy that, would spend a lot of time over the last 2 seasons going through film, one-on-one with the defensemen. And I know that was, I certainly know his reputation is a strong one, not just, obviously with the brass, but with the players. And, I think, you can kind of play both sides to this, and I will play both sides. I mean, I can understand the people who, I feel like it's an underwhelming hire, that it's not a sexy pick, and those people out there, are backed by the argument that, well, if Scott Arniel didn't get a job here in Winnipeg, would he be coveted anywhere else in the NHL? And the answer is probably no. Those people who feel like there needs to be a change from the last 2 years, all those kind of arguments. And of course, the people who are very interested or happy that Scott Arniel has the job. I mean, there is continuity there. There is, as Kevin Cheveldayoff mentioned in his press conference, there isn't that, months of spending time getting to know players, the ins and outs of players, what they're about, how you want to use them, Certainly Scott Arniel hits the ground running here. And the hope, of course, for the organization is to build on the good things of last season, including a 52-win season, as you mentioned, including a team that finished, 4th in the NHL and allowed the fewest goals in the entire league. But the fact of the matter is we're not going to have any idea if this is a good hire or a bad hire, if you will, until they play the games, until we see the season. I mean, that's going to determine whether the Jets are too loyal and can't find anybody else outside of, close connections with the organization, or if this was a brilliant move and that, continuing that continuity, as much continuity as possible, obviously, of course, Rick's gone, retiring, and Brad Lauer has been announced is not going to be returning. But, I think at the end of the day, again, it's just going to be time that tells on whether this was a good choice or not. But I can certainly see the benefits, and I can also understand why some fans out there might feel a bit underwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note, if you're talking about having continuity, because they did speak about that. I mean, they spoke to wanting to continue the foundation that was built in these last couple seasons, because I think you have to. I mean, even the biggest critic would look at this Winnipeg Jets team and think of where they were 24 months ago and where they have come to, albeit without the playoff success, which is a pretty big caveat that, ultimately determines who's the champion. But I mean, this wasn't a team that just snuck into a wild card spot. I mean, this was a team that had played at a high level and maybe more importantly, took care of the cultural issues and built on it and did it again last season into a 52-win team. I mean, Scott Arniel also talked about, everyone needing to get that 5 or 10% better. If you're actually able to do that, you're talking about a really good team because the bar has been set pretty high. But of course, special teams is a big topic today. And, the one bit of news that sort of came out that, I guess for all the people that said, hey, they just keep on going with status quo, it won't be status quo with the assistants. And it was interesting to find out that Brad Lauer is not going to be back.
Yeah, and from the horse's mouth, it was a mutual decision. So I'm not sure if it was a Brad Lauer has a different opportunity, or if the Winnipeg Jets just don't like to say they're letting anybody go. But yeah, Brad Lauer won't be back. I mean, it was tough sledding for the power play last season. There were some built-in excuses, if you will. Of course, Gabriel Vardy played a key role in his inconsistency with injuries, or rather his consistency with injuries, leading to inconsistent times on the ice. Certainly, didn't help his unit, but I think it's been underwhelming for the last couple of years, and I think people want change. And when things don't work out, when you have a great season. I mean, we've seen teams win 2 series, and fire their coaching staff, or so when you don't perform or don't get it done, fans want changes, and obviously with Rick retiring, you kind of had that excuse there, but maybe bringing back the same group. Maybe by looking at or evaluating the roles of the assistant coaches, maybe this is giving Marty Johnston a greater role. But yeah, it was obviously a part that hurt the team. But you could say the same thing about penalty killing. Penalty killing was a huge issue in the season, and it was a huge issue in the playoffs, and a big reason why Colorado made such light work of the Winnipeg Jets, and Scott Arniel ran that unit. So, he got a promotion. Now, I'm very interested to see, who they bring in, and assuming that they replace both Rick Bowness and Brad Lauer. I mean, Marty Johnston was the eye in the sky guy, right? He wasn't on the bench. So, does he move to the bench? Does there's a vacancy for defense? So does that lead to like a Nolan Baumgartner or somebody who's connected to Scott Arniel? I'm interested to see what he, what he does with his staff, what he thinks is, he's been in that position many times, right, Huss? He's been, had his shoulder tapped to, hey, come join this staff, make our staff better. And, he certainly has been in the league in the NHL for a very long time. So he'd have a long list of people who I believe he'd be interested in having over here, or bringing over here. So, we'll see what happens with that, but there is a bit of a shakeup, but I think the shakeup is kind of what where it comes into news that isn't shocking. You can file Brad Lauer's departure under that group as well.
Yeah, and I was listening on the weekend to a podcast out of Buffalo with Andrew Peters and Craig Rivet, and they had Thomas Vanek on, and we'll maybe play this maybe tomorrow or something like that. I'll grab the clip. But Rivet, first of all, spoke about being in Columbus, getting traded to Columbus when Arniel was there, and how much he liked him. And then Vanek started talking about Arniel, and, absolutely loved the guy. But what Vanek said, which was very, I think, interesting from my perspective, is that Vanek said that Arnie was the best power play coach that he'd ever had. Albeit he wasn't doing the power play last year. But it kind of speaks to, I think, the personal level of Scott. And let's face it, he touched on this as well a little bit in the scrum. The game is different, and players have changed. And I think that those personal relationships probably are more important in today's day and age with today's player than they've ever been before. And if there was anything that I think showed the Winnipeg Jets that they had a guy that, they should seriously consider and eventually hire, is what he's been able to do, making those relationships with those players moving forward. Because I think when you look at this team, it's not going to look significantly different next year. You're maybe talking about a couple different forwards, maybe a couple different defensemen. But overall, this group will be pretty similar. And I think in a lot of ways, that is a big part of the reason why Scott Arniel had the leg up over other candidates with what he'd already built with the men in that dressing room.
Yeah, and I think if you were to ask him, and he probably, he touched on it a little bit, but I think the biggest change for Scott Arniel since being in Columbus and, parts of the 2010 to 12 seasons is his, how he, not want to say how he treats, but how his relationships with players. I think in that era, especially when you get your first head coaching gig, you kind of need to make your presence felt, right? It's just over 10 years 10 years ago, but it's a completely different era in this league. And you've seen over, I'd argue over that time, certainly, we've seen, I'm not saying Scott Arniel was some kind of hard ass like Mike Keenan necessarily, but I do think he went in there, tried to make kind of his presence known and, authority felt, and it didn't rub all the players right. Like, I think it's, and eventually your message gets, your message doesn't attach, and you're gone, less than 2 seasons after you get hired. So I think Scott Arniel has learned that, has embraced that, has acknowledged the fact that you need to treat today's players different than yesteryear's group, and I think he's done that. And that's probably as you mentioned, that's probably the greatest asset, or one of the best assets that he brings to this organization. And one of the things that Scott himself said after this season, the biggest thing he learned from Rick Bowness was how he approached the players, how he never let anything kind of simmer or left unsaid, that he addressed things, head on and immediately, and how important that was, to the team chemistry, to the individual players. And I have no doubt in my mind that, he was watching intently, through that process, and adding to, that evolution of how, how he treats players now, how everybody treats players now. I'm making it sound like he was some kind of jerk before. I'm not trying to make that claim, but you have to be a lot, a lot. I don't even know if the word's accommodating or if it's just, empathetic or whatever it is these athletes are under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of, pressure to succeed, pressure to perform, obviously big dollars here. And whereas you used to have coaches that would motivate you with fear, coaches now need to bring out the best in players by bringing them all along and together. And, we saw that with Rick Bowness, and I think we're going to see that with Scott Arniel, not just from what he's learned over the last 12 years, but certainly what he's learned over the last 2 working under Rick Bowness.
Well, and you know what, and I'll say this about Scott, and this dates back 20 years. He has had that personal side of building those relationships, as long as I've known him. I mentioned this, I believe, earlier on the show today, but I mean, when Randy Carlyle was the head coach, there was a real sort of good cop, bad cop dichotomy between the two, and Carlyle could be really hard on guys. And listen, I think at times Bowness could be as well.
Randy Carlyle and Bowness's hard on guys are a little different.
Well, yeah, good point. Good point. But I mean, the players,
you can play good cop pretty easy. Beside, you just had to stand beside Randy.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there was a lot more of a need for that. To especially younger players in the American Hockey League, or International League, when you're removing that. I mean, to be able to kind of be a more positive figure, if you will, compared to Randy, and to bring them up. As far as the coaches, the assistant coaching goes, Scott mentioned that, I don't want to say there's a race on right now, but there are a lot of guys that are probably interested in a number of gigs. I mean, I think it goes without saying that, real focus is going to be guys that, can come in and be positive influences on both special teams units. Any other thoughts on, what would make sense, or ideally good hires, whether it be experience, backgrounds, new ways of looking things, or is it a matter of just fitting in under Scott Arniel, and fitting in with this Winnipeg Jets group that we know is going to be quite similar to last year?
I'd like to think that Scott Arniel, if you're giving the job to Scott Arniel, and clearly they've given the job to Scott Arniel, that he would get to form his group. And so I imagine, and I don't know if that was necessarily the case under Rick Bowness, because I think if you look at the timeline now, the chemistry between Scott Arniel and Rick Bowness and their relationship was clear. So I don't think it was an issue, but it sounded like Scott Arniel got hired as the associate coach before Rick Bowness got hired as the head coach. Whether or not, I'd reported before, Brad Lauer's name was a guy under Barry Trotz's watch, I believe, or maybe it was True North's guy. I know there was a couple different guys that they kind of, we're interested in this guy, coach brings in that. And so I guess my point is to say is that I believe it's probably a group discussion. You talk to the organization, look at their connections. Look, hockey's a small world, and Scott Arniel has a Rolodex of people who I'm sure he doesn't need to reach out to if they're interested. I'm sure his phone is buzzing the last couple days. Guys who are available, open, willing to come, wanting the job, all those things. But you're right. I think it's not just hanging it to your buddy. It's bringing it to, bringing somebody on who's going to fit with the franchise, fit with the culture, of course, fill in whatever role they need to fill in, whatever special teams in this case looks like, possibly, obviously power play with Brad Lauer being gone. I don't see, the head coach taking over that. They certainly oversee it. But, you want a guy who's as an offensive mind, someone who and it's just because of, obviously connection to the team, but I have a hard time thinking you're prying him out of South Florida would be a guy like Jamie Compton. And, whether or not he could be an associate coach or whatever, right? He's kind of known for his power play. And I know some fans in the Jets might be bristling at that. I believe he didn't have every year he was here was all that great. But, I'm just throwing that name out there just because of a guy who has connections to this team and hasn't been a head coach before at the NHL level. Could he be in line for an associate coach job with the potential, you got to remember, Scott Arniel is 61 years old. I'm not saying he's, too old to coach. He's certainly not. I'd have to look at Jamie's because maybe I'm making myself look like a fool here without confirming his age first. But anyways, I just think there's guys. I don't think there will be a shortage of people wanting to be an assistant coach, and I don't think there will be a shortage of guys that people that the organization will be interested in or have a lead on, and certainly Scott Arniel will have a lead on. I mean, he's been dreaming of this opportunity for the last 12 years. I have to imagine, even over this off season, as he went into his interview with the Jets, who, I'm sure he talked about potential hires that he might want to have on the bench with him or that might be interested or who he might be, looking to go after. So, I think the hard part is taken care of, obviously, just making that decision of who you want to run the team. I think getting an opportunity to put a staff together, I think is the fun part, if you will. Certainly for a guy like Scott Arniel, who's got to be just, incredibly happy for this opportunity and eager to get things going and get the work started this off season.